So Hare Krishna, we welcome you to the Sunday Bhagavatam class. We're going to resume with chapter 3 of Canto 1, with Sloka number 30. Etadrupam Bhagavataha
Etadrupam Bhagavataha
Yarupasya Chidatmanaha
Yerupasya Chitatmanaha
Maya Gunair Virachitam
Maya Gunair Virachitam
Mahadadibhir Atmani.
Mahadadibir Atmani.
Word for word meaning, translation and purport. By His Divine Grace, Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Etat,
Etat,
all these.
all these.
Rupam,
Rupam,
forms.
forms.
Bhagavataha,
Bhagavataha,
of the Lord.
of the Lord.
He, certainly.
Certainly.
Arupasya,
Arupasya,
of one who has no material form.
of one who has no material form.
Chitatmanaha,
Chitatmanaha,
of the transcendence.
of the transcendence.
Maya,
Maya,
material energy.
material energy.
Gunaihi,
Gunaihi,
by the qualities.
by the qualities.
Virachitam,
Virachitam,
manufactured.
manufactured.
Mahat Adibhi,
Mahat Adibihi,
with the ingredients of matter.
with the ingredients of matter.
Atmani,
Atmani,
in the self.
in the self.
Translation. The conception of the Virat, universal form of the Lord,
The conception of the Virat, universal form of the Lord,
as appearing in the material world,
as appearing in the material world,
is imaginary.
is imaginary.
It is to enable the less intelligent
It is to enable the less intelligent
and neophytes
and neophytes
to adjust to the idea of the Lord's having form.
to adjust to the idea of the Lord's having form.
But factually,
the
Lord has no material form.
The Lord has no material form.
So the purport, written by Prabhupada. The conception of the Lord, known as the Vishwarupa or the Virat Rupa, is particularly not mentioned along with the various incarnations of the Lord, because all the incarnations of the Lord mentioned above are transcendental, and there is not a tinge of materialism in their bodies. There is no difference between the body and self as there is in the conditioned soul. The Virat Rupa is conceived for those who are just neophyte worshippers. For them, the material Virat Rupa is presented, and it will be explained in the second canto. In the Virat Rupa, the material manifestations of different planets have been conceived as his legs, hands, etc. Actually, all such descriptions are for the neophytes. The neophytes cannot conceive of anything beyond matter. The material conception of the Lord is not counted in the list of his factual forms. So Prabhupada is writing, when Arjuna asks for the darshan of the cosmic form, the Vishwarupa darshan, that darshan that the Lord gives Arjuna, that form doesn't exist. It is just a way to help the Jivatma understand that the sum total of all of this Mahat Tattva is different limbs or parts of the bodies of the Lord. And when you come to the second canto, there are around 10 or 12 shlokas that explain, right from Patal Loka to Brahma Loka, which portions of the Lord's body they represent. But in reality, the Virat Rupa is imaginary. It is just to help the neophyte, someone who is new to understanding that the Lord does have form, to help them conceive that beyond this matter, there is a form of the Lord. But the form of the Lord is never ever material. The Lord is transcendental. Therefore, the Virat Rupa is not listed as one of the incarnations because, technically speaking, it is not an incarnation and it is not real. As Paramatma or Super Soul, the Lord is within each and every material form, even within the atoms. But the outward material form is but an imagination, both for the Lord and for the living being. The present forms of the conditioned souls are also not factual, meaning, even though this body, we experience this body because of the presence of the soul, the body is also not factual in the sense that it is temporary. The present forms of the conditioned souls are also not factual. The conclusion is that the material conception of the body of the Lord as Virat is imaginary. Both the Lord and the living beings are living spirits and have original spiritual bodies. Just that, like the Lord has a Satchidananda form, we also have an original spiritual form that we will gain back once we go back to the spiritual world. So that brings us to shloka number 31.
Okay.
Yatha nabhasi meghaughah
Yatha nabhasi meghaughah
renurva parthivo nile
Renurva parthivo nile
evam drashtari drishyatvam
evam drashtari drishyatvam
aropitam abuddhibhihi.
aropitam abuddhibhihi
Okay. Yatha,
yatha
as it is.
as it is
Nabhasi,
nabhasi
in the sky.
in the sky
Megha ogha,
megha ogaha
a mass of clouds.
a mass of clouds
Renuhu,
renuhu
dust.
dust
Va,
va
as well as.
as well as
Parthivaha,
parthivaha
muddiness.
muddiness
Anile,
anile
in the air.
in the air
Evam,
evam
thus.
thus
Drashtari,
drashtari
to the seer.
to the seer
Drishyatvam,
drishyatvam
for the purpose of seeing.
for the purpose of seeing
Aropitam,
aropitam
is implied.
is implied
Abuddhibhihi,
abuddhibhihi
by the less intelligent persons.
by the less intelligent persons.
Translation: clouds and dust
Clouds and dust
are carried by the air,
are carried by the air,
but less intelligent persons
but less intelligent persons
say that the sky is cloudy and the air is dirty.
say that the sky is cloudy and the air is dirty.
Similarly,
Similarly,
they also implant material bodily conceptions
they also implant material bodily conceptions
on the spirit self.
on the spirit self.
So Prabhupada writes here, it is further confirmed herein that with our material eyes and senses we cannot see the Lord, who is all spirit. So we need to develop the spiritual eyes to see the Lord. You can't see the Lord with your physical eyes. Yes, when you go to the temple, you do take darshan with your physical eyes. But in reality, if you want to experience the Lord, you need the spiritual vision. We cannot even detect the spiritual spark which exists within the material body of the living being. We look to the outward covering of the body or subtle mind of the living being, but we cannot see the spiritual spark within the body. So we have to accept the living being's presence by the presence of his gross body. So, how do you understand that someone is walking, talking, smiling, eating, sleeping, etc.? You can understand the presence of the soul because of the activity that is there of the gross body. Similarly, those who want to see the Lord with their present material eyes or with the material senses are advised to meditate on the gigantic external feature called the Virat Rupa. The Virat Rupa is actually the sum total of all of the universes put together. So if somebody wants to meditate, they are asked to meditate on this imaginary form of the Lord. For instance, when a particular gentleman goes in his car, which can be seen very easily, we identify the car with a man within the car. When the president goes out in his particular car, we say, there is the president. For the time being, we identify the car with the president. Similarly, less intelligent men who want to see God immediately without necessary qualification are shown first the gigantic material cosmos as the form of the Lord, although the Lord is within and without. So, if we have to understand the form of the Lord, we can begin with his material creation. And various aspects of material creation are various parts of his body. The clouds in the sky and the blue of the sky are better appreciated in this connection. Although the bluish tint of the sky and the sky itself are different, we conceive the color of the sky as blue. But that is general conception for the layman only. So the best way for someone who's new to understand that the Lord has a form, because your physical eyes cannot see the Lord in front of you, nor can it experience the Lord within you as Paramatma, then the next best option is to see this entire universe as the form of the Lord. But as we said, the Virat Rupa is actually not real. Which brings us to the next shloka, which is shloka number 32. Atah param yadavyaktam
Atah param yadavyaktam
avyudha guna brahmitam
avyudaguna brimhitam
adrashta shrutavastutvat
adrishtasruta vastutvat
sajivo yat punarbhavaha.
sajivo yat punarbhavaha.
Ataha,
Ataha,
this,
this,
param,
param,
beyond,
beyond,
yat,
yat,
which,
which,
avyaktam,
avyaktam,
unmanifested,
unmanifested,
avyudha,
avyudha,
without formal shape,
without formal shape,
gunabhrimhitam,
guna brimhitam,
affected by the qualities,
affected by the qualities,
adrishta,
adrishta,
unseen,
unseen,
ashruta,
ashruta,
unheard,
unheard,
vastutvat,
vastutvat,
being like that,
being like that,
saha,
saha,
that,
that,
jivaha,
jivaha,
living being,
living being,
yat,
yet,
that which,
that which,
punaha bhavaha,
punaha bhavaha,
takes birth repeatedly.
takes birth repeatedly.
Translation. Beyond this gross conception of form,
Beyond this gross conception of form
is another subtle conception of form,
is another subtle conception of form,
which is without formal shape
which is without formal shape
and is unseen,
and is unseen,
unheard,
unheard,
and unmanifest.
and unmanifest.
The living being has his form
The living being has his form
beyond the subtlety,
beyond the subtlety,
otherwise, he could not have repeated births.
otherwise, he could not have repeated births.
So Prabhupada writes in the purport, as the gross cosmic manifestation is conceived as the gigantic body of the Lord, so also there is the conception of his subtle form, which is simply realized without being seen, heard, or manifested. But in fact, all these gross or subtle conceptions of the body are in relation with the living beings. The living being has a spiritual form beyond this gross material or subtle psychic existence. The gross body and the psychic functions cease to act as soon as the living being leaves the visible gross body. So essentially, in this particular shloka, there is a comparison made as follows. So just like a Jivatma has a gross body, in this imaginary Virat Rupa form, the entire universe itself is the gross body of the Supreme Lord. Keep in mind, it is not real. So you have to think, if I have a physical body made of the 5 elements, the entire universe is also made of the 5 elements. So just like I have a gross body, the Lord in his Virat Rupa, in the imaginary Virat Rupa, the entire universe is his gross. Just like I have a subtle body which is comprised of the mind, intelligence, and false ego. In this Virat Rupa, the subtle body is actually the Virat Rupa form of the Lord. So just like you cannot see your mind, intelligence, and the false ego, you really cannot see the Virat Rupa form of the Lord because it doesn't exist. Just like the concept of I means I, the spirit soul. Similarly, the spirit soul of this universe is Brahma, of every universe. But there is a super soul within every universe, and that is Garbhodakshaya Vishnu. Just like within this body, there are 2 residents, Kshetra and Kshetrajna. Kshetra is the body, Kshetrajna is the knower of the body, as we read in the 13th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. So there are 2 knowers of the body, which is the spirit soul and the super soul. Similarly, within this entire universe, Brahma is considered to be the soul of every universe. And Garbhodakshaya Vishnu is considered to be the super soul of every universe. So the analogy is drawn between the physical body, the subtle body, and the soul to make you understand what this Virat Rupa is. Just as an analogy. The gross body and the psychic functions cease to act as soon as the living being leaves the visible gross body. In fact, we say that the living being has gone away because he is unseen and unheard. Even when the gross body is not acting, when the living being is in sound sleep, we know that he is within the body by his breathing. So the living being's passing away from the body does not mean that there is no existence of the living soul. It is there. Otherwise, how can he repeat his births again and again? Which is the question, or which is a statement that is actually being made in the shloka. The conclusion is that the Lord is eternally existent in his transcendental form, which is neither gross nor subtle like that of the living being. His body is never to be compared to the gross and subtle bodies of the living being. All such conceptions of God's body are imaginary. The living being has his eternal spiritual form, which is conditioned only by his material contamination. So, we are just trying to ascribe the facets that we witness in our own self to the Supreme Lord, but within the material cosmos. Hence, the Vishwarupa Darshan is not really a real form. It is just the Lord demonstrating to Arjuna that everything in the universe is actually coming from him. That brings us to shloka number 33 for today. Yatre me sadasadrupe
Yatre me sadasadrupe
pratishidhe swasamvida
pradishidde swasamvida
avidyayatmani krite
avidyayatmani krite
iti tad brahma darshanam.
iti tad brahma darshanam.
Yatra,
Yatra,
whenever,
whenever,
ime,
ime,
in all these,
in all these,
sat, asat,
sat, asat,
gross and subtle,
gross and subtle,
rupe,
rupe,
in the forms of,
in the forms of
pratishidhe,
pradishidde,
on being nullified,
on being nullified,
swasamvida,
swasamvida,
by self-realization,
by self-realization,
avidyaya,
avidyaya,
by ignorance,
by ignorance,
atmani,
atmani,
in the self,
in the self,
krite,
krite,
having been imposed,
having been imposed,
iti,
iti,
thus,
thus,
tat,
tat,
that is,
that is,
Brahma Darshanam,
Brahma Darshanam,
the process of seeing the Absolute.
the process of seeing the Absolute.
Translation: whenever a person experiences
Whenever a person experiences
by self-realization
by self-realization
that both the gross and subtle bodies
that both the gross and subtle bodies
have nothing to do with the pure self,
have nothing to do with the pure self,
at that time he sees himself as well as the Lord.
at that time he sees himself as well as the Lord.
Okay, so Pure Prabhupada writes, the difference between self-realization and material illusion is to know that the temporary or illusory impositions of material energy in the shape of gross and subtle bodies are superficial coverings of the self. So, a regular analogy that is used in the scriptures is that this body is just like a piece of clothing. And when the clothing is no longer of use to the soul will simply exit that particular body. Therefore, the body is not real. The coverings take place due to ignorance. Such coverings are never effective in the person of the personality of Godhead. Knowing this convincingly is called liberation or seeing the Absolute. As we said many times before, the word liberation has many meanings. Here, the word liberation means to understand this as a fact that the body is temporary and the soul is real. It is permanent. It is eternal. If you've understood this, you're already liberated. This means that perfect self-realization is made possible by adoption of godly or spiritual life. Well, it is quite obvious if you know that you are the spirit soul. The next question is, what is your duties and responsibilities as a spirit soul? So a spirit soul is meant to serve the Lord. Therefore, once having understood this, you will rectify that fact of the life which you up until now have disregarded by practicing bhakti or maybe another path. Self-realization means becoming indifferent to the needs of the gross and subtle bodies and becoming serious about the activities of the self. So when you become a serious practitioner, material things do not matter to you anymore. It doesn't drive you. That's not the purpose for which you live. You live to love Krishna because you find a new purpose in life. The impetus for activities is generated from the self, but such activities become illusory due to ignorance of the real position of the self. So when we begin to accept this physical body as the real thing, when we begin to accept all the material desires that are being produced in the mind factory as real, that is when it is said you are under illusion. When you constantly remind yourself that you are not this body, you are not this physical body, you are not your subtle, your pure spirit soul, then you come out from under the clutches of ignorance. By ignorance, self-interest is calculated in terms of the gross and subtle bodies, and therefore a whole set of activities is spoiled, life after life. So I think in this morning's class I was mentioning, Prabhupada usually uses this analogy that we think we are playing a game of football. And the problem is we think we are the players, but we are actually the football because we are being kicked by Maya all the time. This side, that side, up, down, sideways. But we actually falsely think we are the players. We are actually the football that's getting kicked around. And because we are getting kicked around life after life, Prabhupada is saying we are essentially spoiling our life. We are spoiling the fact that we've received this human form and we are wasting the opportunity because we are not on the path of self-realization. When, however, one meets the self by proper culture, the activities of the self begin. Therefore, a man who is engaged in the activities of the self is called Jivan Mukta, or a liberated person, even in the conditional existence. So, even though you're occupying this body, because you're pursuing the path of self realization, you are considered liberated or Jivan Mukta because you've understood that this body is just temporary. This perfect stage of self realization is attained not by artificial means, but under the lotus feet of the Lord, who is always transcendental. In the Bhagavad Gita, the Lord says that He is present in everyone's heart, and from Him only all knowledge, remembrance, or forgetfulness take place. When the living being desires to be an enjoyer of material energy, the illusory phenomena, the Lord covers the living being in the mystery of forgetfulness. And thus the living being misinterprets the gross body and subtle mind to be his own self. The one more analogy that I have come across is, when a driver is, let us say I own a car and I drive the car, it'll be quite foolish for me to think that I am the car. What makes the car run is diesel or petrol. I cannot feed myself with diesel and petrol and think I can also run. So the fuel that is necessary to operate the body and the fuel that is necessary to connect the soul back to Krishna are two entirely different things. But sometimes we mistake one for the other. And that's when we are under illusion. And by the culture of transcendental knowledge, when the living being prays to the Lord for deliverance from the clutches of forgetfulness, the Lord, by his causeless mercy, removes the living being's illusory curtain, and thus he realizes his own self. He then engages himself in the service of the Lord in his eternal constitutional position, becoming liberated from the conditioned life. All this is executed by the Lord, either through his external potency or directly by the internal potency. Later on in Srimad Bhagavatam, there is a pastime of a king by the name Chitraketu. He had many wives, but no sons to take over from him. So he was always hankering for a son, always hankering. So when great saints come to visit you, instead of asking for spiritual benediction, he ended up asking for, no, I want a son. Therefore, Narada Muni said to Chitraketu, you'll have a son, but he'll be the cause of happiness and distress. So Chitraketu only heard the first part, you'll have a son. He didn't hear the second part, he will be the cause of happiness and distress. So after he had his son by one of his wives, one of the queens, he spent a lot of time with this queen for obvious reasons, because she had produced a son. Therefore, the other queens got jealous and they decided, well, the king has been ignoring us ever since this lady gave birth to his son. What is the best way to get the king's attention back on us? Well, let's just poison the son and get him out of the picture, which is what happened. So the son is killed. And Chitraketu is very despondent that he had lost his son. So again, Narada Muni comes. Again, he doesn't ask for any spiritual benediction. He asks that his son be brought back to life. So through his mystic potency, Narada Muni requests that particular soul to come back. The soul is hovering in air. And Narada Muni tells the soul, here is your father. He is pining for you. What should we do? And the soul says, that's my father. In the previous life, that soul was my son. In a previous life, that soul was my wife. I've already moved on to my next body. And this is when Chitraketu realized that your relationships are temporary. We need to move on. Focus on spirituality, because that soul has already taken another body. What is there? You are sitting here worrying about that person, but that person has disappeared. The soul has gone on into another body. So like this, we come under deep illusion because of our love and attachment for family and a whole lot of other things. So that brings us to the last shloka for today, which is shloka number 34. Yadyesho parata devi
Yadyesho parata devi
maya vaisharadi matihi
maya vaisharadi matihi
sampanna eveti viduhu
sampanna eveti viduhu
mahimni swe mahiyate.
mahimni swe mahiyate
Yadi,
yadi
if however, esha,
esha
te,
de
uparata,
uparata
subsided, devi maya, illusory energy, vaisharadi,
vaisharadi
full of knowledge,
full of knowledge.
Matihi,
Matihi,
enlightenment.
enlightenment.
Sampannaha,
Sampannaha,
enriched with.
enriched with.
Eva,
Eva,
certainly.
certainly.
Iti,
Iti,
thus.
thus.
Viduhu,
Viduhu,
being cognizant of.
being cognizant of.
Mahimni,
Mahimni,
in the glories.
in the glories.
Sway,
Sway
of the self.
of the self.
Mahiyate,
Mahiyate,
being situated in.
being situated in.
Translation. If the illusory energy subsides
If the illusory energy subsides
and the living entity becomes fully enriched
and the living entity becomes fully enriched
with knowledge by the grace of the Lord,
with knowledge by the grace of the Lord,
then he becomes at once enlightened
then he becomes at once enlightened
with self-realization
with self-realization
and thus becomes situated in his own glory.
and thus becomes situated in his own glory.
So in this purport, Prabhupada is writing, because the Lord is the absolute transcendence, all of his forms, names, pastimes, attributes, associates, and energies are identical with him, which means Nama, Rupa, Guna, and Leela. There is no difference. But to understand the Rupa of the Lord, you need to begin with Nama. Then from Rupa, you understand the Guna. And from Gunas, you understand pastimes. The same energy acts as his external, internal, and marginal energies. It's a very important point. The Lord's same energy acts as his external, internal, and marginal energies. And by his omnipotency, he can perform anything and everything through the agency of any of the above energies. So these three energies, when we were reading in the Bhagavad Gita, they are the Antaranga Shakti, Bahiranga Shakti, and Tadastha Shakti. Antaranga Shakti, the internal potency of the Lord that is responsible for creating the spiritual world. Bahiranga Shakti, the external potency of the Lord that is responsible for creating the material cosmos. And then the Tatastha Shakti, or the marginal energy, which is the Jivatma. So the Lord can do anything with any of his energies. He can turn the external energy into the internal by his will. So Mahamaya can become Yoga Maya if the Lord wants. Therefore, by his grace, the external energy which is employed in illusioning those living beings who want to have it subsides by his will of the Lord, by the will of the Lord, in terms of repentance and penance for the conditioned soul. So the same Mahamaya that is trying to control you and take you away from the Lord, the minute you begin to worship that Lord, that same Mahamaya becomes Yogamaya, and you come under the protection of Yogamaya. So Yogamaya's role is to unite you with the Supreme God. Mahamaya's role is to take you away and separate you from the Supreme. But it's the same energy. It's working based on your own desires. If your desire is to be separated from the Lord, then Mahamaya is in your life. If your desire is to be connected to the Lord, then Yogamaya is in your life. It's the same energy. It just functions differently based on your own desire. And the very same energy then acts to help the purified living being make progress on the path of self-realization. The example of electrical energy is very appropriate in this connection. The expert electrician can utilize the electrical energy for both heating and cooling. The same energy can be used to heat a room, and with change in machinery, the same energy can be used to cool the room. Similarly, the external energy, which now bewilders the living being into continuation of birth and death, is turned into internal potency by the will of the Lord to lead the living being to eternal life. So the same Mahamaya becomes Yogamaya for the devotee. For the non-devotee, Yogamaya becomes Mahamaya. When a living being is thus graced by the Lord, he is placed in his proper constitutional position to enjoy eternal spiritual life. So, in this particular section that we covered today, from shlokas 30 to 34, it is essentially talking about the material forms of the Lord and the Jivatma are imaginary. That is the summary of these 5 shlokas that we read. And therefore, both the Jivatma and Paramatma are transcendental in nature, and they are eternal. They are Satchidananda. So, in the next session, we will be looking at shlokas 35 to 39, which describes the Lord, his qualities, and how the unintelligent cannot understand the Lord. So, next week we'll take up the next 5 shlokas. So, do join us. Thank you very much.